welcome to day 4 of the Mindful Relationship Summit that is brought to you by the Awake Network in partnership with Shambhala Mountain Center. And the theme of the day is resilience. Lama Rod Owen is a Buddhist teacher in the Kagyu Tibetan lineage. He has a Master's of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School, and he studies the intersection of identity, social change, and spiritual practice, and is the co-author of Radical Dharma. So it is really lovely to meet you and to discover we're neighbors and to have this chance to talk with you, Rod. Hello, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
So let me just start by asking you, why do you think mindful relationships is an interesting topic? Like, how do mindful and relationships go together in your mind?
Mm-hmm. You know, Susan, I think that it's a very natural fit. Mindfulness actually invites us to be present to what is, and it helps us to actually develop a relationship to what's actually happening in the moment. You know, so when we talk about relationships, you know, relationships really thrive when we're actually present to how the relationship is functioning and going. So many times our relationships are affected because we actually don't know how to listen, don't know how to pay attention to what's happening. You know, so mindfulness as it relates to relationships, I think is critical.
Why do you think we find it so difficult to be mindful in the thing that is most important to most of us, which is love and relationships? Yeah. Why do you think it's so particularly hard there?
Well, I think overall, in general, mindfulness is difficult for us to begin with, period. We have a tendency to be very distracted, you know, especially in things that we potentially enjoy and really like and get a lot of benefit from. And so with relationships, it's the same thing, you know. Yes, these are really important kind of practices of love and compassion and loyalty. But at the same time, we have this habitual tendency to be distracted, especially during the difficult stuff. You know, every relationship has periods where it's quite difficult. You know, there are difficult emotions, difficult feelings, there's tension that arises, and our habitual, you know, thing is to just kind of switch off, you know, to change the channel, you know. And so, of course, I think relationships are one of the hardest, you know, things to actually bring mindfulness into, because they can be so difficult to be present to.
I hear that. So today the theme is resilience, and I suppose that means staying and surviving and riding the waves. And for you, how do you see resilience in relationships, and how has resilience impacted your path?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, when I think about resilience, in my mind, I have this image of falling down and getting back up again. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's almost a way of managing fluctuation, you know, in a sense. And so when I think about resilience, I'm always thinking about, okay, I'm falling, but it's really about how do I get back up, you know, over and over again. Resiliency is something that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about for a while. And resiliency is something that has been a very important practice for me. And it's been something that I think has been, taught to me, given to me, transferred to me through my family lineage.
Really?
So I grew up in the Black community in the South, in Georgia, in a part of the country that was quite full of all kinds of acts of racism, prejudice, discrimination, and racial violence. My family for generations survived and thrived within that kind of environment. And I was born into that kind of, that custom of surviving. And so I was kind of like taught from the moment I was born how to be resilient over and over again. And so I bring that kind of sense of resilience into every interaction that I have, especially into relationships, where I have this, I think, this natural kind of openness to the reality that relationships will be difficult, and that it's about remaining open to the ways in which I kind of get knocked off, the ways in which I trip up. But I'm also really committed to getting up and coming back, and trying to really figure out how to stay steady, in the relationship.
And within yourself, I mean, that is extremely powerful. I was in Texas a few months ago, and I was listening to an AM radio show for the African American population of this particular part of Central Texas. And one thing that the interviewer, the host of the radio show, said that really touched me and impacted me was about his son. He was an older man. His son was grown. He said to his son, "You can do anything you want in this world. Anything you want, but just remember you will always be facing into the wind." And that really, that really pierced me. Like, what is it like to walk around feeling like the wind is not, is against you? Mm-hmm. And so how do you remain open and on your path? Mm-hmm. I know it's a big question that doesn't have one answer, but how did you learn to do that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, in my academic study, I look at intersectionality. Intersectionality in my work means that we are a collection of identities that are continuously intersecting. So some of our identities come with a lot of privilege, others come with less privilege, and they're always in dialogue. And that actually explains how we show up very differently, in the world, and how there are different kind of social pressures that affect all of us very differently, or even not at all. So when I look at my intersectionality and I look at my identities that actually were very disprivileged, being Black, being queer identified, being mixed class or lower class, I was kind of born into that, and that's what I know. Mm-hmm. So my relationship to facing into the wind is one of just normality. So when someone says, "Oh, it must be hard," in my mind I say, well, this is just normal. So you kind of build a muscle to that kind of resistance that you're facing socially, and you just have stronger muscles. The more resistance, the stronger muscles. And so I don't even think about it, in the same way others from more privileged identities may think about it and identify with.
In relationships for yourself, friendships or love relationships or collegial relationships, whatever they might be, is there a time when you need to put down resilience, say, or struggle, or facing into the wind? And is that possible? And how do you trust letting go?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if to let go, I think, doesn't mean that I'm not practicing resilience. I think sometimes surrendering is actually an expression of resiliency. I think that it's about developing a wisdom of when to actually let go and to trust and to surrender. And resiliency is about actually helping us to maintain a kind of equilibrium. But that equilibrium, again, it's surrounded by a fluctuation. So it's always coming back and forth. So it's never like always staying grounded on our feet all the time. It's about saying, okay, this is what equilibrium means. And so I'm always coming back to that, no matter how much I get knocked around. And so I think that, when there's I think that when it's safe and when we enter into a period where there's this kind of openness, the safety, then it's okay to surrender into that. And that's part of the practice of resiliency.
But that just sort of points to, well, you're complex and you're not just this or that. And also the ability to discern between moments of surrender and self-protection and so on, that takes a very big mind. I mean, I'm guessing that your spiritual practice, could you say a little bit about the role your spiritual practice has had in your heart and in your resiliency?
Absolutely. I think before coming into like a more authentic spiritual practice, I grew up in a Christian church. I grew up in the Methodist church. I wasn't extremely connected to, the practice of Christianity. And in my early 20s, I kind of broke away from that. However, for years before actually my break, I was really deeply connected and involved in social change work. So community service, activism, a little bit of organizing. I was really interested in how activism helped to create a kind of self-criticism or a self-critical lens that actually helped me to do a lot of different kinds of work before my spiritual practice in Buddhism began. And so when my path into Buddhism, into actually meditation, and actually my very first practice that I invested in was mindfulness, and then mindfulness led me into Buddhism. I already had this lens, this self-critical lens, and then my spiritual practice actually deepened that lens. So I was able to go really deep very quickly in a way a lot of people aren't in the onset of their spiritual practice. So I already knew how to practice this critical lens, the strategy of mindfulness and meditation and the ways in which it cultivated awareness actually merged with this critical lens, and it just created this deep kind of dialogue with, my internal environment, my deeper self. And that's actually where I'm always coming from. This is actually where this like intimacy of self and the world around me actually emerges from.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Really a blessing.
And so my work in Buddhism and meditation really, it also not only helped me to deepen awareness and this critical lens, but it also gave me practices around compassion and kindness and love that actually helped to create a holding environment for me to do this work of awareness and self-criticism, but in a way that wasn't damaging and it wasn't hurtful or wounding for me, or what I would often say re-traumatizing.
Re-traumatizing. Yeah. That, I really would love to hear what practices and or teachings you found particularly helpful or that you would recommend to others for strengthening their own resilience.
I think basic mindfulness practice is really important and critical. We need a strategy to simply be present to what arises very simply and very basically in our experience. We need a clarity, and that clarity helps us to simply accept what's there and what's happening in the moment. So to be resilient, really for me, first of all, is to accept that something is happening, that this is happening in my experience, this is happening in the world, And so beginning with this basic acceptance, I move into ways in which I can actually support myself in holding steady and being present to what's happening. So loving kindness practice, self-compassion practices, basic practices where I'm connecting to the love, compassion, and kindness that's already very present around me. And I'm just actually opening more deeply to that. I often say that the world is trying to be kind to us in ways that we're not connecting to because of our own hurt and woundedness. So these practices really help me to connect to these really small, basic ways the world is saying, you're okay, I like you, you're valuable, like you're important, and sometimes those acts of kindness comes from a smile from a stranger on the street. It comes from someone opening the door for you. It comes from all of these random acts of kindness that people are doing constantly, but you never know. And so that in my tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, we always traditionally talk about the kindness of the mother, the kindness of our mothers who actually carried us, and nurtured us until we were able to be born, and I know the role of the mother can be quite complicated for many people. But in the tradition, we say that the kindness of the mother helped us to enter into the world, and no matter what happens next, we owe our mothers some gratitude for at least, the 9 months that we spend in their womb. So all those practices really help me to practice this kind of resiliency, every day. And on top of that, just thinking about the ways in which I have to set goals, I have to cultivate the sense of moving forward. I have to, think about the ways in which no matter what happens, my sense of self-worth has to remain really healthy, that inherently I am healthy and good and brilliant and loving and kind, but sometimes I make wrong decisions, and so I'm not inherently bad, but I just make, bad decisions sometimes. And that's where my focus around improvement really happens. It's just about developing a clarity and a wisdom that helps me to make better decisions, So always maintaining a sense of self-worth, opposed to the things that I do that are informed by other factors that have nothing to do with my inherent goodness.
Right. And are you able to, I guess I'm speaking for myself, I find it kind of easier to do that for myself, but sometimes I lose track of the fact that my partner is also good. And how do you find that it's harder to, like, we get mad at people that we're in relationships with and so on, and it's easy to lose track of, again, speaking for myself, that they too are basically good. Do you have any thoughts about that and how to carry that sense of self-worth over to your partner, not to make them feel worthy, but to also hold them as worthy?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that is really beneficial is for me to understand that, like myself, other people are trying to make the best decisions to be happy and to be healthy. But we're informed by these other things that prevent us from making really good decisions, especially in relationships, that we're often struggling to work through these really strong emotions, our own woundedness and our own histories that emerge strongly in a relationship to someone close to us. That sometimes it's actually not me that a partner is responding to, is actually their own histories, their own baggage around unresolved and unfulfilled things in their lives, and it's really about holding space for all of that, because you're doing the same thing.
Right.
We're also struggling through our unmet needs and our insecurities and our traumas, and our partners are doing the same thing. And sometimes you have to step back and to say, okay, this is coming up for us. This is coming up for me. This is coming up for you as my partner. And how do we just cultivate a kind of patience for that to pass through the relationship? How do we cultivate, a sense of being, I would say, sensitive to that kind of working of stuff coming up, and patience, kindness, all of that is so important,
As you're saying, absolutely. And as you're saying that, it's making me feel like patience, kindness are sort of synonyms for resilience. Like they're like are cut from the same piece of cloth, those qualities. Would you say so?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
That's a softer view of resilience that I appreciate than just toughing it out, for example.
That's a more aggressive way of looking at it, but sometimes we do, depending on the situation, it can be having to tough it out.
It's true.
I think when we feel as if there's no space for kindness, for love, then it becomes kind of aggressive kind of duty. When there's no sense of mental spaciousness, then it becomes kind of edgy and rough like that. Like kind of like sticking it out and just like going to it and doing it, going to war.
Right. Painful.
So maybe sometimes that's even not resilience. And sometimes I think that can be other things happening that isn't resilience,
You can think it's resilience, but you're really just being aggressive.
Right.
Yeah.
But we need, as I kind of mentioned before, we kind of need to have an understanding of what equilibrium is for us. What's our basic standing ground? And resiliency brings us, that's a template that brings us back in resiliency. So we get knocked off our equilibrium, we come back to that. So if we actually don't know what our equilibrium is, our basic standing ground, then we actually don't know what to come back to.
How do you know when you are not in your standing on your ground? Because sometimes it's hard to know.
Yeah. Well, I know when I'm not there because I still feel very much ungrounded, and I feel anxious.
Yeah.
I feel there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a sense of not being at home in my body or in my experience. And that's when I know I'm not on my ground and when I'm not standing in equilibrium.
So that leads me to ask this next question, which is, I imagine there are people listening right now who are in really difficult relationships and might feel like, oh, I'm supposed to be resilient. That means I should stick it out no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any, I know it's a really difficult question that no one can answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Is there some sense, any advice you could give to people about when they should stop being resilient?
Mm-hmm.
How do you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it's about our sense of self-care and how we're being cared for. I think that resiliency is about coming back to a place where we're actually being cared for, where we feel safe, where we're not experiencing certain kinds of violence, And so if we're just kind of sticking out and trying to stay in certain relationships, and we have to ask ourselves, okay, am I practicing resilience in order to stay in a relationship that's difficult, or am I practicing resilience because this is the only thing that I know how to do, and sometimes our basic standing ground, our equilibrium is actually, we've taught ourselves that equilibrium is actually a place of actually being devalued, and being shown unkindness and not being cared for, so there has to be this kind of transformational experience where we're actually shifting that standing ground and saying, okay, this is where I thought healthiness was, but actually I have to shift this again. Once we begin to shift that, we begin to see that your whole life begins to shift, because you've been coming back over and over again to centering into this equilibrium, and your whole life has built itself around that. Now you're actually stepping out of that center and moving it over a little bit And that's actually where you belong. And so all this other stuff that's formed around you is no longer useful. And I've seen people do that. I've done that, where people have shifted their sense of equilibrium, and it's almost as if it's like being reborn.
It's so interesting. Mm-hmm. That's so interesting.
And then your resiliency starts to gravitate around this new center.
Yeah, recalibrate.
Yeah,
that came to my mind. That's powerful. Well, I have one more question I want to ask you, even though it's been awesome to talk to you. I hope we'll get to meet in person since we live in the same town, unbeknownst until right now. If there's one thing that we talked about today, one thing that you said today, that if you could open people's heads, just put it in there and close it back up, what is the main thing that you would like people to take away from what you said and from your work in the world around this topic?
So much of my resiliency is centered or concerned with love, And I think one thing that I love to share about love is that love isn't actually supposed to feel good, nor is it supposed to be fun.
What?
I think love actually can bring us into really complex, challenging, and depressing situations, and that's the thing about love that has helped me to develop a more authentic, direct, and honest relationship with myself and how I relate to others in relationships. My understanding of love is the wish for myself and for others to be happy, to experience happiness, to experience freedom. And so love is like this act of freedom, and being free sometimes is not so easy, as we just, finished discussing, because we've built our lives around these really unhealthy centers. And then love means that I have to shift out of that center into something new, and that can be quite painful. But that's the expression of love, to be happy and to be free.
I'm picking up what you're putting down. That's great. Yeah, I feel like people think that finding love means finding safety, and it's actually, there's nothing safe about it. Yeah. And that's what makes it so powerful. So thank you so much. Thank you for offering your wisdom. Thank you for being willing to contribute to this summit. And I know people are going to benefit from getting to know you and hearing your teachings. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan.